So, me caveman, let's go. Number 10. The Red Queen of Palenque. In 1994, deep in the rainforest of Chiapas in southern Mexico, a young archaeologist named Fanny Lopez Jimenez was doing quiet stabilization work on a crumbling pyramid called Temple 13. It stood right beside the famous Temple of the Inscriptions, the tomb of the great Maya king Pakal. She noticed a narrow crack in a stairway, half hidden under fallen masonry and weeds. Behind it was a sealed passage. That passage led to a chamber no living person had entered in roughly 1,300 years. The excavation was directed by Arnoldo González Cruz of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology. When the team finally opened the inner chamber, they found a single, massive limestone sarcophagus. And every surface inside that chamber was stained a deep, vivid red. The skeleton, the jade ornaments, the pearls. The walls themselves were caked in a fine crimson powder. That powder was cinnabar. Cinnabar is mercury sulfide, a mineral that is roughly 86% mercury by weight. To the Maya, it was sacred, tied to blood, to life, and to rebirth, and it was reserved only for the highest elites. To the people crouched inside that chamber, it was something else entirely. They were effectively breathing a cloud of one of the most toxic pigments in the ancient world. Mercury attacks the nervous system and the kidneys, and modern conservators who handle cinnabar today wear respirators and gloves. The woman inside earned an immediate nickname, the Red Queen. The tomb dates to between 600 and 700 AD, the height of the classic Maya period. She did not lie alone. 2 sacrificed companions shared her chamber, an adolescent boy of about 11 and an adult woman, both intended to accompany her into the afterlife. For years, her identity was a mystery. Analysis of strontium isotopes locked in her teeth showed that she was not born in Palenque. She had come from elsewhere, which fits the pattern of a royal marriage alliance. Her bones suggested she was around 60 years old when she died, and that she suffered from osteoporosis. The leading candidate is Lady Ix Tsakbu Ajau, the wife of Pakal himself, whose own remains in the temple next door were also coated in red cinnabar. So who was she really? Mainstream Maya scholars argue she was a powerful royal queen, buried with the honors of a ruler. Some researchers suggest the sacrificial framing points to a ritual offering rather than a reigning noble. And a more speculative camp reads the whole Crimson Burial as dynastic propaganda, a stage set to glorify Pakal's bloodline. What no one disputes is the danger. To meet her, you had to enter a room painted in poison. And that was only the beginning, because the next tomb is tens of thousands of years older, and their grief itself was measured in ivory. Number 9. The Sunghir Burials. On the edge of the city of Vladimir in Russia, about 192 kilometers east of Moscow, lies a site called Sunghir. It was discovered in 1955 during clay quarrying, and the major excavations ran from 1957 to 1977 under the archaeologist Otto Bader. What he uncovered reaches back roughly 30,000 to 34,000 years, into the depths of the last ice age. The site held the burial of an adult man, and then something far stranger and more moving. 2 children, roughly 10 and 12 years old, laid head to head in a single, long, narrow grave. And they were not buried simply. They were buried like treasure. The 2 children wore more than 10,000 beads, each one carved by hand from mammoth ivory. Archaeologists have estimated that a single bead took around an hour to make. Do the arithmetic, and you are looking at thousands upon thousands of hours of labor poured into the burial of 2 children in a world of constant cold and hunger. There were more than 20 ivory armbands, and somewhere between 250 and 300 pierced fox teeth. Then there were the spears. Long lances made from mammoth tusks that had been somehow straightened, one of them over 2.4 meters long. Ivory does not grow straight, so straightening a whole tusk is a craft feat that still puzzles specialists today. Human calf bones were laid across the children's chests, and the bodies were drenched in red ochre. The adult man was buried with around 3,000 beads, arranged in rows that map out the tailored, decorated clothing he once wore. This was a society with surplus, and with the will to mark certain individuals, even children, as extraordinary. One of the children had bowed, shortened thigh bones, a sign the child may have been physically disabled, yet was honored as lavishly as anyone. For a long time, the pair were thought to be a boy and a girl. Later analysis suggests both were likely male. And in 2017, a genetic study led by Martin Sikora delivered a shock. The individuals at Sunghir were not close relatives. These small bands were deliberately exchanging mates between groups to avoid inbreeding, evidence of sophisticated social networks 30,000 years ago. Why this staggering display of grief and wealth? The mainstream view sees an early expression of social status and hierarchy. A more religious reading treats the children as sacred offerings, and some argue the lavish treatment of a disabled child reflects a community that valued the vulnerable rather than discarding them. The cold, sandy, ochre-rich soil preserved the bone and ivory across hundreds of centuries. For the people who excavated it, the unease was not poison. It was the sheer, haunting weight of how much these two deaths once mattered. The next site goes further still, into bodies that simply did not add up to single people. Number 8. The Cladh Hallan Composite Mummies. On the windswept island of South Uist in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland sits a prehistoric settlement called Cladh Hallan. Beginning in 2001, a team led by archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson, working with Jackie Mulville, Helen Smith, and Peter Marshall, began excavating beneath the floors of Bronze Age roundhouses. The houses themselves were built around the 11th century BC. The bodies buried beneath them were older than the houses. The bodies had been placed in tightly flexed fetal positions under the floors. When the team studied the microscopic structure of the bones, they found a strange signature of decay. The bones showed the kind of demineralization that happens when a body is placed in an acidic peat bog soon after death and then taken out again. In other words, these bodies had been deliberately mummified. The bog halted the rot, preserving the flesh, and then the bodies were retrieved and kept. That alone was a revelation. But the bones held a darker secret. Two of the bodies, a male and a female, turned out to be composites. They were not single people at all. The male skeleton was a chimera assembled from at least 3 different individuals. His lower jaw had belonged to a different man than the rest of his skull. The female mummy was even stranger, a female torso topped with a male skull, with a third person contributing other parts. Radiocarbon dating exposed the timeline. The component parts had died centuries apart. One of the male elements dated to around 1500 BC, while the female components dated to around 1300 BC. That means these bodies had been curated above ground for somewhere between 300 and 600 years before they were finally buried as composite figures. Ancient DNA analysis confirmed that the parts came from genetically distinct people. So why build a person out of several dead people? The leading theory is that merging body parts merged ancestral lineages, perhaps to legitimize a family's claim to land, or to bind separate kin groups into one symbolic ancestor. A second reading sees a long ancestor cult, where the preserved dead remained active members of the community. A more practical interpretation focuses on preservation alone, with the mixing a later accident of reburial. Whatever the reason, Cladh Hallan delivered the first hard scientific evidence of intentional mummification in Bronze Age Britain, in a wet, temperate climate where soft tissue normally rots away. When the world's press got hold of it in 2012, the bodies earned a grim nickname, the Frankenstein mummies. For the excavators, the horror came slowly, as the bones refused to add up to whole people. The next tomb rewrote something just as fundamental, the question of when human beings first became kings. Number 7. The Varna Necropolis. In October of 1972, on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria, an excavator operator named Rachel Marinov was digging a trench for an electrical cable. He turned up a few small gleaming objects in the soil. They were gold. He had stumbled into the Varna Necropolis, and the gold he found would turn out to be the oldest worked gold treasure known anywhere on Earth. Excavations were led first by Mikhail Lazarov and then by Ivan Ivanov, running from 1972 to 1991. The cemetery dates to roughly 4,600 to 4,200 BC. That makes the gold about 6,500 years old, more than 1,000 years older than the gold of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Across more than 300 graves, archaeologists recovered around 3,000 gold artifacts, weighing roughly 6 kilograms in total. And then there was grave 43. It held the body of a man in his 40s, laid out on his back, and he was buried like a king. On that one body, the team counted around 990 gold objects, weighing more than 1.5 kilograms. That is more gold than has been found in the entire rest of the world for that whole era, concentrated on a single corpse. He wore gold beads, large gold plates across his chest, gold bracelets on both arms, a gold ornament on his skull, and gold plates on his cheeks. Most strikingly of all, he was buried with a solid gold sheath for his genitals, an unmistakable statement of masculine and political power. He held a stone axe and a copper axe, their handles decorated with gold, symbols of authority rather than working tools. Many other graves at Varna were cenotaphs, symbolic burials with no body at all, sometimes containing clay masks of human faces fitted with gold eyes and mouths. This was, for archaeologists, a conceptual earthquake. Here was a so-called prehistoric community, 6,500 years ago, that already had something like a king and pronounced differences in wealth and rank. The Varna culture sat at a crossroads of trade, working gold, copper, Mediterranean spondylus shell, and fine flint. Their goldsmithing shows a consistency of thin sheet and bead that speaks of real expertise. How did such inequality arise so early? Mainstream archaeologists see an emerging hereditary chiefdom. Others argue the man was the head of a ritual economy, his wealth religious rather than purely political. A third view casts him as a trade baron, rich from controlling the flow of gold and shell. Then, around 4,200 to 4,000 BC, the Varna culture collapsed or dispersed, and the gold tradition vanished, for reasons still debated. The treasures now sit in the Varna Archaeological Museum. The next tomb's discovery began not with a careful trench, but with a robber crushed under a rain of gold. Number 6. The Lord of Sipán. On the north coast of Peru, in the Lambayeque Valley, stands an eroded adobe pyramid called Huaca Rajada. It belonged to the Moche civilization, which flourished from about 100 to 700 AD. And the story of how its greatest tomb came to light is soaked in violence. In November of 1986, a gang of looters led by an unemployed mechanic named Ernil Bernal began tunneling into the pyramid. Around February of 1987, they broke through into a rich chamber. According to accounts of the dig, treasure poured down out of the ceiling so suddenly that Bernal was buried up to his shoulders in gold, silver, and precious stones. The looters carried off sackfuls of artifacts and scattered them onto the black market, which is exactly what alerted the authorities. Then, the looters fell out among themselves. A dispute over the spoils escalated into a shootout, and Ernil Bernal was killed by police gunfire. Among the local grave robbers, the Huaqueros, his violent death hardened into a legend, the curse of Sipán. The man who first cracked the tomb open had died for it. The local inspector general of archaeology, Dr. Walter Alva, launched an emergency rescue excavation in 1987, assisted by the leading Moche scholar Christopher Donnan of the University of California. Beneath a layer of wooden roof beams, they found something the looters had missed, an intact royal tomb. Inside lay an adult man, the Lord of Sipán, wrapped in splendor. He wore a funerary mask of gold and turquoise, beaded pectorals across his chest, and a great crescent-shaped headdress. He did not travel alone. He was buried with companions, several women, a warrior, a child, and even a dog and llamas. One guardian figure had his feet amputated, a chilling symbolic gesture, perhaps to ensure he never abandoned his post. Many scholars consider it possibly the richest intact pre-Columbian tomb ever excavated in the Americas. Later digs at the site revealed still more burials, including a figure called the Old Lord of Sipán and a Moche priest. Who was the Lord himself? The iconography on his ornaments matched scenes painted on Moche pottery, which let scholars connect the art to a real, flesh and blood ruler. The mainstream view is that he was a warrior priest king. Another reading sees him as a man who impersonated a Moche deity in life and in death. And the whole episode became a cautionary tale about looting, with trafficked pieces, including a small gold monkey head bead, eventually tracked across the world and returned to Peru. A treasure that crushed its robber, who then died by the gun. The next tomb's curse was blamed not on a falling ceiling, but on earthquakes. Number 5. The Siberian Ice Maiden. High on the Ukok Plateau, in the Altai Mountains, where Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan meet, the archaeologist Natalia Polosmak made a discovery in the summer of 1993 that would set off a clash still unresolved today. Buried in the permafrost, inside a hollowed larch log coffin, lay the frozen, naturally mummified body of a woman. She belonged to the Pazyryk culture, Iron Age nomads, and she had been interred in the 5th century BC, around 2,500 years ago. She was roughly 25 years old when she died. Later analysis suggested she may have suffered from breast cancer and from a bone infection. Her skin had preserved something extraordinary, elaborate tattoos made with soot-based ink. One on her shoulder shows a deer with a griffin's beak, its antlers tipped with flowers. She had been buried as a person of high status. She wore a tall headdress around 90 centimeters high, a silk blouse, and a wool skirt. 6 horses, saddled and harnessed, were buried with her to carry her into the next world. To free her body from the ice, the team poured hot water over the burial, a method that was effective but deeply controversial because it risked damaging the very remains they were trying to save. The reaction among the indigenous Altai people was immediate and furious. To them, she was no specimen. She was a sacred guardian, the keeper of Altai, a protector against evil forces, and her removal had torn open something that should have stayed sealed. When a powerful earthquake of around magnitude 7.3 struck the region in 2003, along with severe floods, many locals blamed the disturbance of her tomb. Elders demanded that she be returned and reburied. Her remains were stored at a research facility in Novosibirsk from 1993 until 2014. In 2012, regional authorities decided she should return to the Altai Republic, and she now rests in a special mausoleum at the Anokin National Museum in Gorno-Altaysk. The Ukok Plateau itself has been declared a restricted zone of peace, limiting any further excavation. Who was she in life? The popular interpretation casts her as a priestess or shaman, given her tattoos and rich burial. A more cautious mainstream view sees simply a high-ranking woman of an elite clan. And to the Altai themselves, she is and always was a spiritual guardian whose role transcends archaeology entirely. Her story has become a landmark in the debate over who owns the ancient dead and whether science has the right to disturb them at all. The next body raised the same dread, not through earthquakes, but through a string of deaths among the very people who touched it. Number 4. Ötzi the Iceman. On the 19th of September, 1991, two German hikers named Erika and Helmut Simon were crossing the Tisenjoch Pass in the Ötztal Alps, on the border between Italy and Austria, more than 3,200 meters up. They saw a brown human body, half emerged from the melting glacier ice. At first, everyone assumed it was a mountaineer who had died recently. It was not. It was a natural mummy, more than 5,300 years old, from the Copper Age. Europe's oldest known human mummy. He was named Ötzi, after the valley. He carried a copper-bladed axe, evidence of early metalworking, along with a flint knife, a longbow, and a quiver of arrows. A CT scan in 2001 revealed an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder. Ötzi had been shot from behind and had bled to death on the mountain. His body carries 61 tattoos, and his stomach contents and clothing have been studied in extraordinary detail. He now rests in a custom-built cold cell at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy. And then there is the curse. Over the years, a series of people connected to Ötzi's discovery and study died, and the headlines could not resist. Rainer Henn, the forensic pathologist who handled the body with his bare hands, died in a car crash in 1992 on his way to a conference about the Iceman. Kurt Fritz, the mountain guide who had led Henn to the body, died in an avalanche in 1993. Rainer Hölzel, who filmed the recovery, died of a brain tumor in 2004. The pattern grew. In 2004, Helmut Simon, the man who found Ötzi, went missing on a hike and was discovered dead in the same mountain region where he had made his discovery. Dieter Warneck, the head of the rescue team that searched for Simon, died of a heart attack shortly after Simon's funeral. In 2005, Konrad Spindler, the archaeologist who first examined Ötzi in Innsbruck, died of complications from multiple sclerosis. Spindler had once dismissed the curse, joking that he supposed he would be next. That same year, Tom Loy, the molecular biologist who analyzed Ötzi's blood, also died. So is the curse real? The skeptical, mainstream answer is that hundreds of people have worked with Ötzi over the decades, and the overwhelming majority are alive and well. Picking out a handful of deaths is selective pattern matching. A second view holds that the curse is essentially a media creation, a story too good for newspapers to drop. And a third, the believer's view, insists the cluster of deaths is too pointed to be coincidence. Whatever the truth, Ötzi transformed our understanding of Copper Age diet, tools, clothing, and violence. The next tomb's timing turned coincidence into one of the most famous curses in all of history. Number 3. The Tomb of Tamerlane. In the city of Samarkand, in modern Uzbekistan, stands a mausoleum with a fluted turquoise dome called the Gur-e-Amir, the Tomb of the King. It holds the body of Timur, the 14th century conqueror known in the West as Tamerlane, who died in 1405, along with several of his descendants, including the astronomer King Ulugh Beg. And in June of 1941, this tomb became the center of one of history's most cited curses. A Soviet scientific expedition, ordered under Stalin, set out to exhume Timur and confirm that the remains truly belonged to him. The expedition was led by the anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, famous for reconstructing faces from skulls. As the team prepared to open the tomb, local elders reportedly warned them not to. They spoke of a curse. According to the legend, the tomb bore inscriptions warning that when Timur rose from the dead, the world would tremble, and that whoever disturbed his rest would unleash an invader more terrible than Timur himself. The team opened the tomb on the 20th of June, 1941. 2 days later, on the 22nd of June, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest and deadliest land invasion in human history. The timing was so uncanny that for many, it sealed the curse forever. Gerasimov's scientific work, set against that backdrop, was a triumph. He confirmed that the body was a tall, powerfully built man with a lame right leg and a damaged right arm, exactly matching Timur's nickname. Timur the Lame, which gives us the word Tamerlane. The man stood around 1.7 meters tall. From the skull, Gerasimov produced a famous forensic reconstruction of the conqueror's face. But the skeptics have a strong case. Operation Barbarossa had been planned by Hitler in 1940, and the Second World War had already begun in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. The timing of the tomb's opening, they argue, is pure coincidence, however dramatic. Even so, Stalin himself reportedly came to believe in the curse. He ordered Timur reburied with full Islamic rites, and the reburial took place in December of 1942. And here the legend twists once more, because some link that December reburial to the Soviet turning point at the Battle of Stalingrad. So how do we read it? The documentary view treats the whole thing as a striking but meaningless coincidence wrapped around real science. A folklore reading sees a self-fulfilling prophecy, a story that gained power because people believed it, and a small speculative camp still wonders whether the omen meant something. Historians even dispute whether the curse inscriptions existed as described. What is certain is the collision, science, war, and superstition meeting in a single tomb. The next curse is the most famous of them all, and modern laboratories think they have finally explained it. Number 2. The Tomb of Tutankhamun. On the 4th of November, 1922, in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, the archaeologist Howard Carter peered through a small hole into a sealed chamber. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, stood behind him. Inside was the most intact royal Egyptian tomb ever found, packed with thousands of objects. And at its heart, the boy king Tutankhamun, an 18th dynasty pharaoh who had died around the age of 18 or 19, about 1323 BC. The golden death mask of lapis blue and gold would become the most recognizable object from the ancient world. Then, on the 5th of April, 1923, just a few months after entering the tomb, Lord Carnarvon died. The official cause was blood poisoning, set off by an infected mosquito bite that he had nicked open while shaving. To a sensational press, that was all the proof anyone needed. The curse of the pharaohs was born, and it raced around the world. The novelist Marie Corelli and others fed the frenzy, warning of doom for anyone who disturbed the tomb. But the numbers tell a more sober story. Of the 58 people present when the tomb and the sarcophagus were opened, only about 8 died within the following dozen years. Howard Carter himself, the man most responsible for the entire excavation, lived until 1939 and died of lymphoma at the age of 64. If there was a curse, it spared its most obvious target. So what actually killed the unlucky few? Modern science points to a toxic mold. Aspergillus flavus and Aspergillus niger can grow in sealed tombs over centuries. When a chamber is opened, disturbed spores drift into the air and can be inhaled, causing a serious respiratory infection called aspergillosis, which is especially dangerous to people with weakened immune systems. Lord Carnarvon had badly damaged lungs from a car accident back in 1903, which would have left him gravely vulnerable. Dormant spores can lodge in the lungs and cause illness months later, which fits the timing of his slow decline. There is even a precedent. In 1973, scientists opened the 15th century tomb of King Casimir IV in Poland. Several people involved later died, and aspergillus was found inside the tomb. Sealed chambers can also build up ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and pathogens carried in bat guano. And in a remarkable twist, in 2024 and 2025, researchers reported that compounds drawn from Aspergillus flavus, the so-called curse fungus, showed promise against leukemia cells. The fungus also produces aflatoxins, among the most potent natural cancer-causing agents known. How should we judge the curse now? The supernatural reading still thrives in films and folklore. The scientific reading credits toxic mold and tomb gases, and a statistical reading, including a 2002 study in the British Medical Journal, found no real difference in lifespan between the exposed and everyone else. The final tomb takes the danger to its limit, a tomb so deadly that even today, no one will open it. Number 1. The Mausoleum of Qinshi Huang. Near the city of Xi'an in Shanxi Province, China, rises a great earthen mound. It is the burial place of Qinshi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who died in 210 BC. The necropolis around it covers roughly 56 square kilometers, and of every tomb in this video, this is the one that scarred archaeologists in the most absolute way imaginable. It frightened them so completely that more than 2,200 years later, they still refuse to open it. The story began in 1974 when local farmers digging a well-struck fragments of fired clay. Those fragments led archaeologists to one of the greatest finds in human history, the Terracotta Army. An estimated 8,000 life-size soldiers, along with horses and chariots, each soldier given an individual face, arrayed in battle formation. But the soldiers are only the guard. They stand watch over the central burial mound, and that central chamber has never been entered. We have a description of what may lie inside, written by the historian Sima Qian in his Records of the Grand Historian, about a century after the emperor's death. He wrote that the tomb contained rivers and seas of liquid mercury, made to flow mechanically, representing the great rivers of China and the sea. He described automatic crossbows rigged to fire on any intruder, and a ceiling set with the heavens, the sun, moon, and stars. For a long time, this read like pure myth. Then modern science tested the soil. Researchers detected anomalously high concentrations of mercury in and around the burial mound. A study published in 2020 using laser-based gas sensing recorded atmospheric mercury near the mound reaching up to around 27 nanograms per cubic meter, against a normal background of roughly 5 to 10. Even more striking, the distribution of that mercury in the soil roughly matches where ancient China's rivers and coastline would lie if you map them onto the tomb. Sima Qian's rivers of mercury appear to be real. That's exactly why the chamber stays sealed. Liquid mercury gives off vapor that is acutely neurotoxic. Opening the chamber could release a genuinely lethal atmosphere. And there is a second warning written in the excavation's own history. The terracotta figures were once brightly painted, but their pigments flake and fade within minutes of exposure to dry air. Chinese authorities have judged that they simply do not yet have the conservation technology to open the tomb without destroying what is inside. Ground surveys suggest a large chamber beneath the 76-meter mound, built by hundreds of thousands of laborers. And ancient accounts claim some craftsmen were sealed inside to protect its secrets. There is a final, grim irony. The mercury that fills the tomb may have been both a symbolic cosmic ocean and a relic of the emperor's obsession, for mercury compounds were taken as elixirs of immortality, and may well have hastened his death. So, how do we read Sima Qian now? One view holds his account is a faithful record, now vindicated by chemistry. Another sees exaggeration, embroidered over a kernel of truth. And a third takes the texts and the mercury at full value, a genuinely booby-trapped tomb. This is the rare case where modern science backs the ancient legend, and still, no one dares open the door. Look back across these 10 tombs, and a pattern emerges, one that has nothing to do with ghosts. Many of these so-called curses rest on hard chemistry and biology. The Red Queen and the first emperor share a single poison, mercury, in the cinnabar dust of Palenque and the mercury rivers of Xi'an. Tutankhamun and Casimir IV share another, the toxic mold Aspergillus, which fills sealed chambers with spores that attack the lungs. That same fungus produces aflatoxins, among the most potent natural carcinogens we know. The list of genuine tomb hazards is long. Bat guano can harbor the fungus that causes histoplasmosis. Sealed spaces accumulate ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, Radon, a radioactive gas, can build up in deep rock-cut chambers. The air itself can be starved of oxygen, the old miners' dread of bad air. There are physical dangers too, like the collapsing, treasure-laden ceiling that buried the looter at Sipán. Even rescue methods carry risk, as when hot water was poured over the Ice Maiden, threatening the body with contamination. People with weakened bodies are most exposed, which is why Lord Carnarvon, with his scarred lungs, was so vulnerable. Early excavators worked with no masks, no gas monitoring, no protection at all, breathing whatever the tomb released. Today's protocols call for respirators, air testing, and slow, controlled excavation. The deeper lesson sits underneath every one of these stories. The line between superstition and real occupational hazard is thinner than it looks, and opening a tomb can be physically irreversible. Some chambers really are safest left shut, but not all scars are chemical, because some of the deepest wounds these tombs leave are in the mind. To be scarred for life is not only about poison in the lungs. For many of the people in these stories, the wounds were psychological, and they lasted. Imagine the slow, dawning horror at Cladh Hallan, as the bones on the table refused to belong to single people. Imagine standing over the Sunghir children, 10 and 12 years old, buried under 10,000 beads, feeling the weight of a grief 30,000 years deep. There was guilt and ethical conflict too. The archaeologists who excavated the Ice Maiden found themselves cast as desecrators, accused by a whole people of unleashing earthquakes and floods. The colleagues of those who died after touching Ötzi had to live under a curse narrative, whether they believed it or not. Lord Carnarvon's circle endured a global press that treated each new death as proof of doom, and Walter Alva spent the Sipán excavation guarding a tomb against armed looters who had already killed. There is a particular dread in being the one who let something out. Indigenous communities carry real trauma when their ancestors are disturbed and displayed in glass cases. Researchers can be haunted by what they have seen, by the intimacy of holding a person who died millennia ago. The fear is rarely about literal ghosts. More often it is the fear of consequences, of having crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. That is what scarred for life truly means here, a mix of mortality, responsibility, and memory. And it raises a question that has grown louder with every decade. Whose dead are these, and who has the right to disturb them? The Ice Maiden of Ukok is the flagship case of a debate now reshaping archaeology. The Altai people claimed her not as data, but as a guardian, demanded her reburial, and won protections for her plateau, now a restricted zone of peace. Their argument was simple and profound. Consent across 2,500 years is impossible to obtain, so perhaps some dead should be left where they lie. Sipán tells the parallel story of looting, the trafficking of moche gold scattered a king's burial across the globe, and the long fight to bring pieces home, including a single gold monkey head bead, became a model for repatriation. Around the world, museums and source communities now negotiate over who holds the ancient dead, weighing scientific value against spiritual harm. Frameworks have grown up to manage these claims, descended from laws that returned indigenous remains to their descendants. The questions multiply. Who has authority over a prehistoric body? Is it ethical to display the actual corpse of a person, as we do with Ötzi, and once did with countless mummies? Indigenous knowledge increasingly informs how digs are done and whether they happen at all. The economics of heritage tourism pull one way, the dignity of the dead another. And conservation itself has become an argument for restraint. Sometimes the most ethical choice is not to excavate. Attitudes have shifted enormously since 1922, from the confident plunder of Carter's era to the careful stewardship of today. Part of why the first emperor's tomb stays sealed is not only the mercury, but a new humility about disturbing the dead at all, which leaves us facing how much, even now, we still do not know. For all the science, these tombs guard their deepest secrets still. The Red Queen's identity remains unconfirmed, the link to Pakal probable but unproven. No one fully understands why Sunghir lavished such wealth on 2 children, or what the Cladh Hallan composites were truly meant to do. The cause of the Varna culture's sudden collapse is still argued over. The exact social role of the Ice Maiden, priestess, or simply elite stays open. Other mysteries are sharper. We do not know exactly who killed Ötzi, or why he was shot in the back high on a mountain pass. We cannot be sure the curse inscriptions on Tamerlane's tomb ever really existed as the legend claims. We have no honest measure of whether tomb curses caused any deaths at all beyond chance and chemistry. And above everything looms the greatest unopened question of all. What actually lies inside the sealed chamber of Qin Shi Huang? Do the mercury rivers still flow? Do the crossbows still wait? There are limits to what we can learn without digging. Non-invasive imaging can map a chamber, but cannot read what is written inside it. Countless tombs remain undiscovered, and many known ones remain unexcavated by choice. Future technology may one day let us enter the first emperor's tomb safely, and DNA may yet resolve identities that texts cannot. The biochemistry of ancient tomb toxins is still being worked out. The gap between Sima Qian's words and the ground truth beneath the mound has narrowed, but not closed. Which brings us, at the end, to the strangest lesson of all, that sometimes the wisest thing an archaeologist can do is choose not to open the door. We began in a chamber painted red with poison and end at a door no one will open. That is the arc of these 10 tombs, from the cinnabar dust of the Red Queen to the sealed mercury seas of the first emperor. Each one is a time capsule of belief and power, and each one exacted a price from the people who reached inside. Those prices were physical, in lungs filled with spores and skin dusted with mercury. They were psychological, in the dread that followed Ötzi's discoverers, and the guilt that shadowed the Ice Maiden's excavators. And they were ethical, in the slow recognition that the ancient dead were people, not merely artifacts to be carried off. For some of these openers, scarred for life was no exaggeration. It was simply what happened. There is a quiet maturity in how archaeology has changed. The age of conquest, of prying open every tomb because it could be done, has given way to stewardship, to the humility of leaving the first emperor's chamber closed for a future better equipped than we are. What stays sealed stays preserved. And yet, the wonder never fades, the same pull that drew people down those passages in the first place, toward gold and grief and the faces of the long dead. Beside the wonder stands the warning, the danger that waves us back. Legend and chemistry, it turns out, are braided together more tightly than we ever guessed. Picture an archaeologist standing before the great mound at Xi'an, instruments in hand, choosing not to enter. That is the final image, the tomb that wins by remaining shut, its secrets and its scars intact, waiting. The question it leaves with you is the one that runs through every story here. When the cost is this high, how much are we truly willing to pay to know?